Hello and welcome in, friends, to a Dragons Dogma tier list video. Now, the tier list today is going to be purely subjective. It is specifically on which vocations are the most fun, at least for me. And I do expect people to disagree with me or to have differing opinions on which vocations they had the most amount of fun with when playing Dragons Dogma Dark Arisen. Now, when it comes to the specific tiers in the list, I didn't want to simply just have the generic S to D tier. Rather, I wanted to be very specific on my reasons for ranking certain vocations higher than the others. So starting at the top of the tier list, we have Lots of Fun, highly recommended. This is also specifically for vocations that I invested a lot of time in, and also genuinely really enjoyed the role that it played, as well as a lot of the movesets that came with the vocation. As for the middle tier, adequate amount of time invested. That is to say, I had a fair amount of fun with the vocation in terms of both leveling and also genuinely having fun with the moveset that it provided. Now, the bottom tier, limited amount only for leveling. That is not to say that the vocation is by trash at all means or a weak vocation by any means whatsoever. It is just my personal subjectiveness in saying that I didn't spend as much time invested in those vocations for specific reasons, and those reasons being that I wanted to level a certain way. By all means, again, let me know if you would switch vocations or my order of ranking in the comments as well. And the order I want to organize these by is first by basic vocations, advanced vocations, and then ending with the hybrid vocations. Now, with each vocation, I want to give a brief overview of the playstyle and what role it's supposed to play in your party, and then also to give my personal experiences and how much fun I had with it, and then justifying it with specific reasons of why I had an X amount of fun with it. Now, before we dive into the tier list itself, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping on the side. For newer viewers who only stumbled across this video, my main content does revolve around Baldurs Gate 3 modded character builds, and also a little bit of Total War Warhammer 3 narrative campaigns for modded factions. As for the returning viewers to my channel, whether you subscribe to me for the character build videos or for the narrative-driven campaigns, thank you so much for bearing with me. I want to expand my horizons in terms of the content that I want to showcase on this channel, hence the reason why I'm sprinkling in some more videos of Dragons Dogma 2 and also eventually modded Skyrim playthroughs in the future. Starting off with our tier list, we have the Fighter, which I'm going to put an adequate amount of time invested. Now, the role of the Fighter is that of your basic sword and board frontline unit, and essentially almost acting like a one-man doom stack against hordes of enemies or even against tougher semi-boss enemies too. Now, the thing with the Fighter is it may come off as very basic, however, it does have an adequate amount of moveset to make it versatile too. Now, the reason I specifically put it in adequate amount of time invested and a fair amount of fun too is because, to be honest, it is a very good class in terms of both advanced players and even new players actually having fun with it and really just putting a lot of time and effort into making yourself useful in combat, but also being very engaging as well. Now, some of the more advanced movesets of the Fighter are Dragon's Maw, which I really love a lot. It's essentially like a spin move, and it's a really good crowd control moveset, but also it's specifically even strong against boss enemies too. Speaking on the Fighter's additional moveset, Heaven's Word Lash is a very useful move in terms of taking out the more annoying flying enemies such as harpies. As for the shield skills, there is a lot of really good pairing and synergy here too. Shield Drum is really good for drawing the aggro of enemies to focus fire and attacks on you, with Perfect Defense being able to tank all of those attacks too. And essentially, what I mean by synergy is by drawing the ire of most of the minor enemies or even the more advanced enemies toward you, the rest of your party can follow up with buffs or additional attacks of their own while enemies are only focused on you. And also, launch board I specifically like a lot in terms of specifically having a strider in my party and then literally yeeting them at a boss and then following up with attacks of my own while they're climbing all over and distracting them, but that is just my personal playstyle. Next vocation on the tier list we have Mage, which I will put in the tier of limited amount, only leveling a certain amount to. Now again, that is not to say that this is a weak vocation or that some people may not have fun with it, but what I've noticed myself, and well, before I get too ahead, is the role of the Mage is essentially a healer and buffer. Yes, you do have some offensive spells such as Ingle and also some ice and lightning attacks. However, the damage potential is not as much as, let's say, a Sorcerer, which we will be getting to later on in the video. And the playstyle that I've had with a Mage is essentially just being, like I said, passive and buffing my pawns and main pawn with some fire-based attacks or healing them should they find themselves in a very close pinch. Taking a look at the specific moveset available to the Mage, we can see that Grand Anodyne is going to be the only healing spell available to this vocation in particular. We also have a lot of packs here, which is just enchanting your weapons of the party with these different types of effect. Holy and Fire being the most useful as far as I've seen in my playthroughs. Not a lot of creatures tend to be very weak to dark packs. Very specific boss enemies are though. The last of the basic vocations we have is the Strider, which I'm going to put in the tier of lots of fun, highly recommend. The basic role of the Strider is to act as a thief or essentially pillager, rogue, what have you, and the moveset really reflects this too, which we will get into very soon. But the reason I put it in this specific tier is because I had a lot of fun just messing around with enemies and not just providing debuffs, but to really just act like essentially a medieval Spider-Man of the battlefield. Now, taking a look at its specific moveset, some of the moves that I really personally love a lot would be Dazzle Hold and Ensnare. Basically what these moves do is with Ensnare, it throws out lots of cords to pull enemies down and essentially act as a crowd control. Dazzle Hold also is very good for crowd control too, as you essentially throw a bunch of fireworks into enemies' faces, stunning them. Both of these really good stun effects. And also in terms of the third one of the other ones I personally really like, and this is only specific for a particular playstyle, Pilfer. It's what it sounds like, steals items off foes, and it's a really good way of collecting additional ingredients if you really are invested in the crafting part of the game. The bow skills of the Strider are also adequate, but they're not as advanced as, let's say, the Ranger, which we'll be getting into very soon in this tier list as well. Some of the useful bow skills are Shriek Dart, with stunning enemies in an area of effect, and also Splinter Dart. Splinter Dart I more so lean towards because of that explosive damage and crowd control, similar to what Shriek Dart can offer. Moving on to the advanced vocations, these are the basic vocations, but leaning into specific aspects about them, and you'll see what I mean as we speak about them for this part of the video. Now, one of the first vocations that most people may feel gravitated towards and seeing as high damage output is the Warrior, but I'm going to put it in the bottom tier of limited amount. And again, that is not to say this is a weak vocation at all. In fact, the raw damage output from the Warrior itself is essentially like a boss killer, but It's also adequate at crowd control. However, my specific issue with it, now this is just a personal issue too, mind you, that it trades out the defensive capabilities of the fighter with leaning more into the offensive capabilities of having a great sword or a hammer if you want to go with bludgeoning damage instead. Now, for the role of the warrior, it fills the same role as the warrior. However, you are running that risk and reward with foregoing the shield and staking all of your bets in making sure that you're able to dish out enough damage to kill off both mobs of enemies and also the advanced enemies or the bosses too. As for the warrior specific moveset, I will admit I did enjoy using Corona Slash, which is basically like a helicopter spin in terms of crowd control for the lesser enemies. Arc of Deliverance, yes, like I was saying, is a very good move in terms of channeling all of your damage into one blow and having the potential to one-shot or nearly one-shot and take out a boss enemy's massive amount of health. But going back to what I said earlier too, this is a risk and reward vocation, and even more so a risk and reward move that you are going to stake all of your bets on. If you do not have one of the skills of Bastion, or essentially what's considered good poise and being able to tank that amount of damage, then your Arc of Deliverance will get interrupted. But I will admit too, going back to the tier list, when it comes to leveling, Warrior does have its merit in terms of being the vocation that as you level up with it, you gain the most amount of health if you level up as a warrior, if that makes sense. So that's why I'm putting it in that specific tier. It is still viable. However, for me personally, I only leveled it for a small amount of time compared to some of the other vocations. Moving on to the Sorcerer, this is essentially the advanced vocation of the Mage, and I'm going to put it in the tier of lots of fun, highly recommend, and specifically because it fills the role of a glass cannon. And I know a lot of you RPG friends in the comments will know exactly what I'm talking about. For those who don't know, this is essentially a vocation that has very little armor, very weak in terms of dealing head-on with enemies. However, the moveset that it provides is essentially like a one-shotting boss enemies in a very epic fashion too. Now, specifically speaking, some of those one-shot movesets such as Sezum, Belide, and Giselle, those are essentially like long casting spells, which yes, you do have to position yourself in such a way far enough from a boss enemy, but just barely in range that the spells will hit. And like I was saying before too, this is killing your enemies off in epic fashion too. Maelstrom is more so for crowd control. It's essentially summoning a giant tornado. Exequi is very useful too. It's essentially like a necromancy spell. It's kind of like the Screaming Avada Kedavra, or basically casting a dark ritual and instant deathing your enemies as well. As an added side note too, the Sorcerer is really good if you want to level up specifically Magic Attack, and Magic Attack is going to be very useful for the late game too, in terms of ignoring enemy defenses. The last advanced vocation we have is the Ranger. Now, I was considering on putting it in the middle tier of adequate amount of time invested, but admittedly, I did have loads of fun playing as this specific vocation, and yes, it does not have the flashy moveset of the daggers, such as the Strider, and also it's not as bombastic as the Sorcerer. However, one merit I will give to the Ranger is that if you need to level up stamina by a massive amount, it's definitely the vocation for that. And stamina is arguably, in my opinion, one of the more important things to level up, because it just similar to Dark Souls, if you run out of stamina, then you pretty much are a walking dead person, because the enemies can attack you on a whim without you running away or dodging out of the way too. Now, taking a look at the specific moveset of the ranger with the longbow skills, you have a good variety that is very versatile in terms of different playstyles too. Comet shot, very much essentially just being able to snipe enemies from afar, and the ability to do that without them even knowing of your existence can be a huge make or break in terms of how difficult an upcoming fight may be too. Gamble draw, it's essentially kind of like what the warrior has, but you don't run as much of a risk for enemies taking you out. You can do this from afar and pull it off more successfully than the one-shot swing of the warrior too. There's also a fair amount of status and debilitating arrows too, such as crippling arrow, which is essentially what you will be using on boss enemies that have a massive hitbox and specific parts that stick out, or could be weakened to even more of an extent. Flying Din, which stuns an enemy but also doesn't do any damage, so that's the trade-off there. Bodybinder is good in specific situations in terms of keeping enemies in place while you take out weaker ones too. To wrap things up, Ranger is an advanced vocation that I would personally say is good for an advanced player too. Newer players may find that the other arrow movesets will be harder to pull off, but at the same time too, an advanced player or veteran player will really devastate the battlefield with this vocation, in my personal opinion, and it's very much fun to master. Wrapping up with the hybrid vocations, these are what they sound like. They're essentially the basic vocations that are combined together to provide different types of synergies and combinations. With the Magick Archer, I am placing it an adequate amount of time invested. Right off the bat, I will say it's a really good class for leveling up magical defense if you want to go that route. I was always more so someone who really put more time and effort into leveling up offensive capabilities more so. However, I will say the Magick Archer can synergize well if you level up as a sorcerer specifically, because like I said, sorcerer is really good for leveling up magic attack, and the magic attacks of the Magick Archer will be bolstered if you level up as a sorcerer, such as Secret Bolt, firing magical arrows up to 5 foes, and the advanced version, Hunter Bolt, firing up to 10 magical arrows too. Magical Flare is also very useful too, although it is really just mostly viable against undead forces too, but the flash it creates is really good at stunning enemies for a short period of time. Ricochet Seeker, it's good for enclosed dungeon areas, so again, a very situational skill to have. Funnel Trail, I personally really enjoyed a lot too in terms of crowd control and pulling enemies in a specific area, and really just different types of bolts that you could use. However, I will say the weakness is that magic bow skills relies only on magic, and enemies who are resistant to magic like golems, you'll have to rely on daggers in terms of actually doing damage to them with their weak spots too. But that's just me getting into specifics as well. Magick Archer, I could really just put in between both adequate and also having lots of fun too. Now for the Assassin, this is essentially combining the Strider and Fighter together. I will say I had a lot of fun with it in terms of its versatility too. Assassin, if I remember right, levels up the most in just pure raw strength, so if you really wanted to maximize the amount of overall physical attack, this is definitely the class to put your time and effort into. Like I said before, I love min-maxing my offensive capabilities, so Assassin was one of the vocations that I really put time and effort into. And also, surprisingly, Assassin can pair pretty well if you level up as a Sorcerer, as there are some magical daggers that rely on, like I said, magic attack that can fill in that gap that the Assassin has as well. So taking a look at the Assassin skill set too, because you have access to both sword and shield skills and then also the bow and dagger skills from the Strider, you have a huge amount of moveset, probably in my opinion like the most movesets out of all of the vocations overall too. I'm not going to go over every single one of these because it is going to bloat this video out of control, but I really want to focus on some of the dagger and sword skills too, such as the sword skill of Gouge, repeatedly stab a large foe that you're clinging to. This is specifically for climbing purposes too. Gouge on a Cyclops or Gorclops will just outright nearly devastate, or if not one-shot them too. You have the Windmill Slash, which literally is you just spinning your sword in a figure 8 motion, and really just like it describes here too, carving a path towards enemies too. And this is very ridiculous of a move to have, but Powder Blast I personally really like for that explosive damage, and yes, again, more crowd control capability, but also the Powder Blast itself can take out boss enemies too. Some of the crazy and flashy dagger skills you get as well, like Snakebite, poisoning enemies and literally knocking them down. Two more passive ones like Stealth. It's a good get out of jail free moveset of making yourself invisible and also impossible to hit, so you can reposition yourself. Following up with a masterful kill when an enemy does target you. This is your counterattack, but then also you punish an enemy for daring to strike against you. This is good for enemies that have predictable or slow moving attacks, and it's, like I said, a good way to punish them and then follow up with that near one-shot attack too. And last but certainly not least, the Magic Knight, which I am going to put in lots of fun, highly recommend. It may seem like a very passive class in terms of combining both the mage and the fighter, so you are filling that frontline role of being that protector of the party, but then at the same time having some spells of your own to cast, and also be a very offensive turret essentially. Now the reason I say turret is as we scroll down to some of the sword and mace skills, we do have what is called Magic Cannon. It's what it sounds like. It creates this orb that you can strike multiple times that will also send out bolts of a specific element towards your enemy. Bring it up with a combination of attacks will send out multiple bolts at once to strike your opponents. I also really like Perilous Sigil. It basically places what's considered like a magical mine on the ground and traps enemies as well as devastating them for damage too. Taking a look at the magic shield skills, we can see that you don't just have the opportunity to riposte and counter enemies who attack you, but you also have the possibility of inflicting status effects such as slowing enemies down with abyssal riposte, and also dealing out elemental damage too, such as fire, frost, and thunder as well. But overall, my playstyle with the Magic Knight is laying mines down around me, and also literally summoning a magic cannon to launch attacks without getting hit myself too. You really do become a different kind of one-man doom stack with this vocation, and it's both entertaining, hilarious, and very satisfying in my personal opinion. Alright friends, that has been my Dragons Dogma vocation tier list in terms of how much fun I had with the specific classes. Let me know if you agree or disagree with my placements, and if you do disagree, please let me know specific reasons why you had more fun with one vocation or another in the comments below too. I really want to get a good in-depth discussion on character builds with all of you and what your personal strategies and playstyles are. Like I said, this is just my subjective opinion. Let me know yours in the comments, and also if you're a new or returning viewer, thank you for taking the time to watch all the way through with this video too. And if you're a fan of either Dragons Dogma or want to see some more character builds in that game, Baldurs Gate, potentially modded Skyrim, which I do promise to upload more of those types of videos in the future too. I'd love to have you join us on those adventures, friends. So remember to hit the like, subscribe, and bell icon notifications, and I'll save you a seat at the table. Take care and farewell.